But hey, good morning. If we haven't had a chance to meet yet, my name is Garry. I am one of the pastors here. And thanks for spending some of your time with us today, wherever you're doing that from, live stream, from home, across the hall in Theater 2, or right here. Man, it's so good to see faces here in Theater 6. Welcome here. As Russ mentioned, we're kicking off a new series for the month of June called Hot Rod Theology. And if you're not into hot rods, that's okay. You will be by the time we're done. But what we're doing is, this is our attempt, as feeble as it may be, to do what Jesus did so well when he taught. He would take something people were familiar with, like farming, fishing, parenting, ranching, and he'd use it as an example to help them understand a deeper spiritual truth or reality that was really important. And so we're going to do the same thing. We're going to use something that we're somewhat familiar with, and that is a hot rod. And we're going to look at the components that make a hot rod a hot rod. Now, a hot rod is defined as a motor vehicle that has been specially modified to give it extra power and speed. And it's all about the speed, right? Now, for the most part, hot rods are typically American-made cars. They might be old, like a Model A. They might be classic, like a Mustang or a Corvette, or they might be modern. And they've all been rebuilt and modified with large engines, optimized for speed and acceleration. Now, in a couple of weeks, on June 19th, just 2 weeks from now, is Father's Day. And I know a lot of you here, and maybe watching online, every Father's Day, your annual Father's Day thing is to go to Qualicum Beach to the show and shine, okay? Even if you're not into hot rods and muscle cars, man, it is something to see. I mean, it's at Qualicum Beach. I mean, how beautiful is that? But here's the thing. Even if you're not into it, go to it. Get this. Not that I put a lot of stock into what she says, but Oprah Winfrey actually listed it as one of the top 10 things to do on Father's Day, to go to the Qualicum Beach show and shine. How cool is that? Okay, so a good friend of mine, and some of you here watching online may remember him. His name is Andrew Toma. You remember him? He used to drive around town in one of these. Okay, and I remember the first time he got it, he came by and he said, "Hey, you want to go for a ride?" I was like, "Sure." I felt like I was in an amusement ride car, not a car that you would go on the highway with. I mean, smart cars are small. They should be called small cars, not smart cars. I remember pulling up when we were out for our drive. We pulled up beside a dump truck, and I remember looking up at the guy, and the tire dwarfed us, just the front tire. Now, consider a hot rod Lincoln. Compared to the smart car that could quite literally be blown off the road with not much more than a gentle summer breeze, a hot rod has the appearance of having the ability to face anything, any obstacle that might come its way, right? So I want to ask you a question. With a smart car and a hot rod in your mind, when you think about the kind of life you want to have, what kind of life do you want to have? Do you want to have the kind of life that can face the challenges and the obstacles that inevitably come our way? Or do you want to have the kind of life that's kind of blown about by the wind? And I think we all know the answer, right? You want the one that can withstand the obstacles. There's some words found in the Bible that paint a picture of the contrast of these two different kind of lives. And here's what it says. It's in the Old Testament. There's a book called Psalms, and it's full of these poems and songs and laments. Man, you talk about real and honest. The writers that wrote in here, I mean, they were letting it all out. It's a fantastic read. And this is how this whole book opens. Chapter 1, it says, "Oh, the joys of those who do not follow the advice of the wicked, or stand around with sinners, or join in with mockers. But they delight in the law of the Lord, meditating on it day and night." And here's what he compares them to. They are like trees planted by a riverbank, bearing fruit in each season. Their leaves never wither, and they prosper in all they do. But not the wicked. They are like worthless chaff, scattered by the wind. few years ago, my son-in-law, Jeff, and I went on a motorcycle trip down through the U.S. We went Washington, Oregon, California, Nevada, Arizona. I mean, we were all over the place. It was great. It was awesome. Well, at one point, we were heading through Idaho. We had climbed up this mountain pass, and we were at the top of the mountains, and we kind of just got spilled out into this mountaintop plateau. And we were headed to Idaho Falls, and if you've never been to Idaho Falls, put it on your bucket list, man. It's a beautiful, beautiful city. It's so awesome. I love it there. But anyway, we're heading across, and I mean, the road is straight and boring, kind of like the landscape that it was on. The only thing that really stood out were the mountains off in the distance. I mean, it was just beautiful, but the road itself was kind of boring. Well, on this particular day, as we're heading along this road, there's a pretty strong crosswind blowing, and it was strong enough to blow these things around. Tumbleweeds. Have you ever seen a tumbleweed? I was trying to think, it's like, because I remember so vividly seeing them. I don't think, up until that point, I don't think I had seen one in real life. I'd seen them on Westerns, right? You know, Clint Eastwood with his squinty eyes and the tumbleweed going by. But I'd never seen one in real life. They're not just a movie prop. They're these unanchored, dead bushes being blown in whatever direction the wind decides to blow them in. Now contrast that to this, a willow tree. We used to live beside a lake, and our neighbor on the one side of us had this massive willow tree, and the thing was huge. I don't know how old it was, but it must have had this massive root system, and it must have been, I don't know how many years old, which means it would have withstood, you know, many a hot, dry summer, wet, windy, stormy winters. So again, which of those would you want your life to resemble? A flourishing tree or a dead tumbleweed? Flourishing tree, right? And so the question becomes, how do I get that kind of life? How do we get the kind of life that isn't just blown here and there by the wind, but rather can stand firm when life comes blowing in and beats against the side of our life? And I would suggest that the surest way to do that is to read this. And it's not popular mechanics. It's the Bible. And do it on a regular basis. Now, you may be sitting there thinking, well, yeah, that's a pretty Sunday school answer, obviously. Here's the thing. It sounds simple. Simple does not mean easy, right? There's a complete difference between simple and easy. And I would venture to say that most of us here or watching online are thinking, yeah, that's a great idea. And we have the best of intentions. Maybe even after today's service, you're going to go, you know what, I'm going to start reading the Bible every day, right? But then what happens? Life gets in the way, doesn't it? Yeah, and we don't get around to it. It's just like, I was going to do it. I'll do it tomorrow. And a whole bunch of tomorrows go by. Now, am I the only one really that struggles with this? I mean, life gets hectic. We got jobs to go to, chores to do, errands to run, lunches to make, dinners to prepare, laundry to sort, wash, and fold, get the kids to school, get them back from school, get them off to their extracurricular activities like soccer or hockey or dance. And if it's not time that gets in the way of us reading the Bible, it's that we believe the Bible is irrelevant to life today in Nanaimo 2022. It's got nothing. What could that, written thousands of years ago, have to do with my life today? And so we just don't read it. What's the point? Is that true? Is the Bible irrelevant? Does it have anything to do with helping us live life today in Nanaimo 2022? Well, in the first book of the New Testament, a book called Matthew, named after the man who wrote it, there's an account of Jesus' first and arguably best sermon or talk that he ever gave. It took place on it's called the Sermon on the Mount today because it took, you'd think, it's on the side of a mountain, but it was kind of a hillside. But they call it the Sermon on the Mount. They didn't call it that back then, but they do today. And we talk about that sermon a lot around here because it's chock full, it's crammed full of practical advice on how to live a better life. I mean, get this. In this sermon, Jesus talks about stuff like hatred, lust, marriage, lying, revenge, love, generosity, forgiveness, money, anxiety, hypocrisy, relationships, and how to navigate all of that stuff in a healthy way. I don't know. Seems pretty relevant to me. You know, anxiety, relationships, don't get angry. Now, here's the thing. Jesus is a smart guy. Around here, we believe that Jesus was God in the flesh. That's a Christmas story, right? And that because of that, he's the one that created us. And if that's true, then he knows us better than we know ourselves, even better than our spouse, if you have a spouse, knows you. Okay? He knows our tendency to push aside good advice that we would actually do well to follow, which would go a long way in explaining why at the end of this talk that Jesus gave, he does something, if not brilliant, bizarre, to help emphasize, highlight, underline, underscore, bring the lights to the importance of everything he just taught. As the crowd's sitting there listening to Jesus' every word, he lowers his voice to get them to lean in and listen to what he's going to say. And then he breaks into this heart-wrenching, tear-producing story that no one will ever forget. It's Jesus' hallmark moment. Actually, that's not what he does at all. Jesus does not end this talk with a feel-good story. He doesn't end off his talk with some sticky statement that's crafted to stick in your brain so you're thinking about it as you make your way to the car or your way home from the service. You know, like, my past will remind me, but it will not define me, something like that, right? He doesn't end his talk with some acronym like fully relying on Jesus, FRODGE, you know? Get this, Jesus doesn't even close in prayer. It's like, oh, what? Doesn't close in prayer? You know what he closes with? He closes with a stark warning. I was never taught to do that in seminary in my preaching courses. I don't think Peter has been either. It'd be weird, you know, the professor standing there. Okay, all you young, well, not necessarily young, but aspiring pastors, here's how you close a sermon. You know, you got the crowd there, and you just share a really scary story, one that's going to just scare the crap out of them. Then close in prayer and go home. I mean, that would just be weird, right? But that's what Jesus does. It's bizarre. So here's what he said, okay? So he's gone through all this teaching. Here's what he says. Therefore, and just pause there for a second. I learned this. Whenever you read therefore in Scripture, look to see what it's there for. Right? Okay? In other words, look at everything that was said beforehand. So you could put it this way. Jesus was saying, therefore, in light of everything I just taught you, everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on the rock. The rain came down, the streams rose, the winds blew and beat against that house. Yet it did not fall, because it had its foundation on the rock. But everyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice is like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. Rain came down, the streams rose, the winds blew, beat against the house, and it fell with a great crash. Boom, that's it. Mic drop. That's all he says. And what do we read next? It says, the crowds were amazed. And so the question I ask is like, why would Jesus end what I believe is the most important, the most influential, the best speech ever given in human history? Why would he end it with such a formidable, foreboding story? That there, what Jesus did here, is what I love about his teaching. He's real and he's honest. And his parables are so interesting. There's more to them than what we first see. It's kind of like the movies. I don't know if you've seen Inception or The Matrix, Star Wars, maybe the TV show Lost. When you watch those shows, everything that happens in those shows happens for a reason. Now, you may not see it at first. You watch, you say Inception, and you watch, you go, whoa, that was good. And so you watch it again. And it's like a piece falls into place that you didn't see before. And you're like, oh, I can see how that ties in. How cool is that? So what you're doing is you're beginning to connect dots. And as you connect dots, you begin to understand more. And as you begin to understand more, you get excited about watching it again. That's how Jesus' parable works. So a lot of the Bible works. On the surface, Jesus' parables can seem pretty straightforward. And some of the principles we can learn from them are, for instance, in this story, it's wiser to build a house on the rock than on the sand, right? But is that what this story is about? Building codes and construction practices? More often than not, in order to understand what Jesus is getting at, what he's wanting us to see, requires us to go back and read it again. Just slow down and read it again and again. Because everything Jesus says and teaches is there for a reason. For example, in this story, Jesus talks about a few things. So we're just going to look at a couple of them. First thing Jesus talks about is two houses. What's with the houses? What do houses have to do with everything Jesus just taught? Like, do not murder, do not get angry, forgive people, be generous. Like, houses? Like, really? What does it have to do with it? Well, the short answer is everything. Because in first century Jerusalem, your home, your house, was everything. People's entire lives revolved around their house. For example, if you had a son and he took a wife, you would build on an addition to your home where him and his wife and his future kids could live. He would often take the same trade as you. And we think, oh man, imagine living like that. Well, it almost looks like we're going to have to with the house prices around town, right? Much like we've experienced over the last couple of years, you would work from your home. If you were a fisherman, a farmer, a bricklayer, a carpenter, your house would be where your office is. It would be your place of business. And so when Jesus mentions a house in this story, he's not simply referring to a literal house. He's talking about the entirety of a person's life. Everything, your relationships, your career, your physical, spiritual, and emotional well-being. The house represents your and my entire life. The other thing Jesus mentioned in this story is a storm. A storm that results in flooding. It says there, the rains came down and the streams rose. So what's with the storm? Well, back when this was written, it was quite common for writers back then to use storms as a literary image that described the unavoidable hardships of life. Just like storms would suddenly blow in off the lake or down the mountains, the same thing happens in life. And so people would have back then, as they're listening to Jesus talk about this storm, they would have understood that Jesus was not talking about a literal storm, but rather the storms that inevitably blow into our lives for no other reason than we exist on this planet. Crappy stuff just happens. Last week, a good friend of mine was here, and you may have met him. He came to our church last week. The reason he was in town was his mom and dad, elderly parents, were on a trip across Canada, through Western Canada. And they stopped in Edmonton to visit some friends, and his mom slipped and broke her hip. She had to have emergency surgery, which meant, it all went well, but she couldn't drive home. She had to fly home. So their son, my friend, drove their car home, came down to Parksville where they lived to make sure they were all settled in and everything was all good, or appointments were all set up and everything else. It just happened. It's not like his mom woke up one morning and looked out the window and went, it looks like a really good day to break my hip, so I think I will. No! Life just happens, right? It just happens. And to be clear, if you're sitting here thinking, well, I know why the storm. That's God's way of punishing. He's showing you, if you don't follow me, I'm going to punish you. It's not that. God's not wagging a finger or shaking his head in disgust or anything because of something you've done or not done. That's not what it's about. Crappy, unavoidable stuff happens in life. It just does. Jesus experienced it the night before he was crucified, when he sat with his closest friends around that Last Supper. He let them know all that was going to happen to him, how he was going to be betrayed by someone in the room. And that betrayal would lead to an arrest, and the arrest would lead to a conviction, and the conviction would lead to his execution. And after he finished saying, this is how it's all going to play out, guys, he said to them, I have told you these things so that you may have peace. Because in this world you will have trouble. Storms. Jesus didn't say, guys, there's a chance some crappy stuff is going to happen. Or some lousy stuff might or could possibly happen, so be ready. He's like, no, it's going to happen. It will happen. In this world, you will have trouble. As I look around here and imagine people online, we all have storm stories, don't we? I mean, we've been in a collective storm for the last 2+ years. It's still not over. Lousy, random, unexpected, unexplainable stuff happens. It's part of being on this planet. Jesus, going on the theme of people, also mentions two people in this story. One who is wise and the other who is foolish. In the original language, wise, phromenos, referred to someone who is thoughtful and enlightened. Someone who is prudent and thinks life through. The other is foolish, morose, which is the root word for our word, moron. It's someone who is heedless, not thoughtful, unenlightened. They're living in the moment with little or no concern about the future. Two houses, a storm, two people. Meaning much more than meets the eye. So here's how we could read the story. With those insights in mind, here's how we could read these words of Jesus. There was a very thoughtful man who built his entire life on rock. And when he encountered unavoidable hardship, his entire life stayed standing. There was another man who was foolish and built his entire life on sand. And when he encountered the exact same unavoidable hardships, his entire life came down with a great big crash. Reads completely different, doesn't it? There's more. And I would suggest, in fact, that if we're not careful, we could actually miss the coolest, if not most important part of this whole story. I mean, from the surface, cultures change, right? We advance, we kind of progress. If you want to build a home today, there are building codes, building practices. There's experts, architects, engineers, building crews who specialize in foundations. And so today, if we saw someone building a house on the sand, we'd go, idiot. Like, what are you doing? Right? But here's the thing, and this is the important part to understand. When Jesus talks about sand, we would be remiss if we thought Jesus was talking about sandy beach sand. Here's why. Again, Jesus is speaking to a group of people who live in a different part of the world, different time, different culture. And they live beside this large lake. It's so large, it's called the Sea of Galilee. It's in Israel. In this part of the world, and the same is true today, there are long stretches of hot, dry weather in the summer months. And when that happens, what happens is the sun bakes and hardens the sand to the point where it feels and looks just like rock. It's kind of like fool's gold. You ever familiar with fool's gold? Looks and it feels like gold, but it takes an expert to kind of tell you, sorry, you didn't hit it rich. It's not gold. The same is true with this sun-baked sand. It looks and feels like rock, but it's fool's rock. It's not real. And that's why in this story, when the weather is nice, when there are no hardships, these two houses look like they've been built on a solid foundation. From the outside looking in, they both look like beautiful, sturdy homes. Years ago, my wife and I lived in a neighborhood right across the street from this young family. They had some kids. They had the golden retriever. They drove a really nice car. They had a trailer, a boat, nice home. And it looked like they had it going on. I mean, this was before Facebook, right? And you compare your life, everyone else's highlights to your own life and go, man, my life sucks. This is before Facebook. And when I watched these people, that's what I thought. It was like, my life sucks compared to theirs. Look at them. They're all out in the yard playing together and working together. From the outside, looking in, everything seemed rock solid. And then the storm came. And their marriage blew apart. When the weather's nice, things are good, it can appear that our lives are built on a solid foundation. It's when the storms come that we'll truly find out what our lives are actually built on. And again, that's one of the reasons I love Jesus and I love this. He is so upfront. He doesn't pull any punches. He doesn't sugarcoat the human condition and go, you're going to be fine. He tells the truth. And in this story, he is extremely clear that there is a storm coming. In essence, what Jesus is doing in this story is he's blowing up some of the teaching that I grew up with and hearing that wrongly suggests that, you know what, if you get God, life is good. That if you get God, everything's going to be rosy. No more problems, no more storms. It's like he's going to put a big high pressure ridge around you and all the storms will go around you. It's simply not true. In this story, the wise person had to suffer through the same storm the foolish person did. The difference was that one man's house or life was able to withstand the storm, while the other person's house or life fell with a great crash. One person's life was like a tree planted by the water. The other's life was like a tumbleweed being blown here and there by the wind. Listen, if you take anything from today, it's this. Jesus doesn't promise a storm-proof life or a storm-free life. What he does promise is a storm-proof life. So the question goes back to what we asked at the beginning. How do I get that kind of life? How do I get a storm-proof life? Well, the answer is in plain sight, interestingly enough, right at the beginning of the story. Jesus says, therefore, everyone who hears these words right here and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on the rock. Both of these people built beautiful, sturdy-looking homes on what appeared to be solid foundations. One was built on this, the other on maybe the hopes of the world, or salary, or job, or career. The difference between these two people, the deciding factor between your life, my life, standing, or your life or my life falling apart with a great crash, is wisdom and foolishness. Wisdom hears and then puts what Jesus says into practice. Foolishness hears Jesus' words and doesn't. Period. End of story. Full stop. You and I want to have a storm-proof life, the kind of life where you can experience God's peace, that peace that transcends all understanding. Like, you've got this storm going on, dude, and you look like as calm as a cucumber. What is going on? That kind of peace? When a storm is beating against your life, it's found not in just reading this word, although that's a good place to start. It's actually putting it into practice. Doing things like honoring your mother and your father, loving your enemy, forgiving someone that needs your forgiveness, being generous, treating others as you would like to be treated. Listen, the Bible's anything but irrelevant. It's a gift given to us by God so that we can learn about what he's like, how he works. He speaks to us through this thing. Listen to this. Abraham Lincoln put it this way when he talked about the importance and the relevance of the Bible. He said this, "I believe the Bible is the best gift God has ever given to man. All the good from the Savior of the world is communicated to us through this book." And another well-known president gave this as a reason to read the Bible regularly. "Within the covers of the Bible are the answers for all the problems men face." Ronald Reagan. Charles Spurgeon, one of the most influential pastors in recent history, wrote this. He said, "A Bible that is falling apart usually belongs to someone who isn't." And this wasn't attributed to anybody, but I thought I would include it because it's so good. Whether we are reading the Bible for the first time or standing in a field in Israel next to a historian, an archaeologist, and a scholar, the Bible meets us where we're at. Because that's what truth does. You know, maybe you're sitting here and you said, "Yeah, well, I've read the Bible. I've read through it." But here's a question. Is it a daily, regular thing? Because that's where you're going to receive wisdom. It's where you're going to learn to hear God's voice. Or maybe you're sitting here and it's like, I never even cracked the pages of it. And that's okay. You're wondering, like, how do I even start? Just start. Sounds simple, I know, but start at the beginning of the New Testament. One of my favorite books is the book of John. Beautiful book. Or sign up for class 2. It's happening this afternoon. We got one happening this afternoon. One of the things we're going to be harping on here, pounding away on, is our discipleship pathway. It's called the River. We talk about it a lot, and you're going to hear a lot more about it because Jesus asks us to go and make disciples. It doesn't say show up on a Sunday morning and have a great time and go home. Make disciples. And so we call it the River because a journey with Jesus is like going down a river, man. It's moving all the time. Sometimes it's fast, sometimes it's bumpy, sometimes it's slow. Sometimes you're in a back eddy, you're just kind of swirling around, waiting, but it's always moving. And class 2 is where you're going to learn about the essential habits of what a Jesus follower has. And you know what? There's 4 of them. And the first one, you know what it is? Learning how to read this on a regular basis. Now, registration for that closed on Wednesday. We sent an email out. We've got some people coming to it. But you know what? I was talking with Russ. We believe in the importance of this so much that we're going to open it. If you're sitting here and you're thinking, you know what, I would love to take that, we're opening it up. You can sign up right now on your app, on the website, or you just come and see Russ and I after the service. We'll get you. It's happening today at 1 o'clock at the Brood. It used to be the old Buzz down on Dufferin, across from Country Grocer. We would love to have you attend. And all I will say is, when you leave, you will not look at your hand the same. But you're going to have to sign up to find out what that's all about. You know, a hot rod can have a fancy-looking engine. It can look cool sitting in the parking lot. But if it doesn't actually run, there's not much chance of finishing or even starting a race. And the same holds true with us. This is our engine. And it doesn't do much good sitting on a shelf or an unused app, because a lot of people, we use apps now, which is fine. It may look good sitting on a shelf. People come over, oh, they got a Bible on the shelf. But if you're not using it, it doesn't do us any good. Love this old commercial. Russ reminded me of this. It's a Volkswagen commercial, and it said this: on the road of life, there are passengers and there are drivers. Drivers wanted. And the question is, which are you? Let's pray. God, we just thank you for this gift called the Bible. And it can feel so intimidating, so overwhelming to read it. But man, if we just approach it and say, okay, God, I'm going to start reading this. I have no idea what I'm reading, but I'm going to trust that you are going to show me something. And then just read and watch what happens. Give us all the courage to do that. Help us carve out time. Help us to prioritize this over all the other stuff that crowds in our life. We just thank you for your patience with us. And the fact that you loved us so much that you gave us this, that we can take it with us, we can learn from it, learn to see what you're like, learn how to navigate these storms that come at us, whether we want them to or not. And so help us to do that well. And we pray all of this in your beautiful name. Amen.